So, I'm this guy on the internet. If you have any questions, feel free to tweet them at me. Otherwise, I think there's the speaker corner. I don't know where it is, so maybe we'll figure it out later at the end, okay? I work for a company called Rove. We're consultants. So what does a consultant do? They come to your company, they grab your money, and then they spend it to go to conferences. So today we're talking about a bit of history of what we did. I think it's a good idea to look at where we were and where we are going. And let's start from 2002. I mean, this was around the time where I started doing some professional PHP. Who started before that? Very few. I'm sorry, Derek. I know you started before. So we have the tools. They're probably not the best tools, but we got customers. So we want to sell some goods to some, I wouldn't say necessarily good intention, people with good intentions, but still, we got customers. We got to get stuff going, and therefore we start writing software. So just a word of warning here. A lot of the code that you're going to see is probably going to ruin parts of your retina, okay? But I think every one of us wrote code kind of like this. So let's start with, obviously, how we initialized our scripts. I mean, this is the modernized version because register globals doesn't work anymore. But obviously, what we had is this nice loop, and we did this ugly little thing, and we have our initialized variables. Why? Because we used to do that. That was the way. And then you can work with the scripts. We didn't know any better. We didn't know what the problems were with this. So pretty much how we started all the projects. And then we had everything slammed together in one script, and we had some magic going on, because obviously this previous inclusion of a magic script makes things a bit harder to follow. But this is, again, how we used to do it. So in this case, if we are purchasing something, right, and the user is a coyote, that's our security layer. Helps a lot, right? That was the security layer, right? We used to do it. Then we obviously select the product ID. Well, escaping, nobody knows what that is anyway. So we can actually introduce some arbitrary SQL to improve the usability of our product. We forgot to add something really important here, so which, I mean, every serious developer would have an or die Mysql error. You want to tell people what is wrong with your website, especially to people that are doing SQL injections. And then you fetch some records, and obviously we do some credit card validation. How many here do remember saving a credit card? Yes, I did that. I will not tell you when or where, but anyway. Obviously there's success. Success is the thing that we store, and we store it in a variable somewhere. And then we do some, yeah, well, imagine that success is false. That would be awesome, right? And then we insert some data, right, some arbitrary data. Of course, we allow anything again. And then we send some emails, and that's pretty much it. And then we slam it together with this, what we call the view. I mean, I'm making it nice here because I have 3 different files, but you know exactly that this was not the case. We slammed everything together. Because, you know, separating things, it's just more files. Did you know, by the way, that on PHP 3, if you run a script on PHP 3, which probably nobody really used here, you need to remove the comments because the script is evaluated line by line. So the more comments you have, the slower the script is, which is kind of weird. So here we have like our view, and we render something. And of course, the success may not exist here. And of course we exit. And of course exiting is like a 0 exit code. So it's really, really hard, honestly, to debug the scripts. But again, we didn't know any better. The security layer is also quite awesome. Yeah, security. What is security? We were pretty much new to all this. And we did all the same mistakes. There was no real community yet. There was nobody teaching anything about it. I think the OWASP initiative didn't even exist at the time. But the point is, projects used to be pretty much simple. somebody came in and said, I want a counter for my website, and that's it. I want a static website, that's it. There was no like, let's write booking.com, which, by the way, is written in Perl, and probably at that age and time, it was written at that time as well. But still, projects were small. We were talking about small websites. The internet was, what, 10 years old? 9 years old, something like that. So nobody really knew what we were doing. It gets the job done. It's not really safe. You probably need to be constantly called because something is wrong, because somebody managed to do an SQL injection, because the database was corrupted. If you had a database and you didn't use a CSV file that is shared across all clients. Yes, we did that too, a CSV file where everyone writes to. Yeah, so it's not all shiny, but it gets the job done. And then we had, obviously, globals everywhere. We used the globals initially. We used the globals pretty much everywhere to share state. It was PHP 4, so we didn't have a real object-oriented model. I'm not even sure if the object-oriented model is a good idea anymore. But that's a different thing to be discussed later. So we're getting things from somewhere. And the other thing that I recognize is this include functions.inc.php.inc, of course .inc at the end. Remember the config.inc? So you can browse the website, just config.inc and read the passwords. That was awesome. It was awesome. You take an old website, you deploy it to a new server that is not configured to hide those files, you can see everything. So these are the helpers, in my opinion. This is what I would define as a helper. So we're talking about something that helps us in getting where we want to go, and it has nothing to do with, well, if we can call it business logic. If we can call it business logic. I distilled it to the smallest possible example with the purchase, but that's what we would call business logic. And the helpers are like doing things in parallel. They have nothing to do with it. They do redirects, they give us a link, they provide some HTML snippet. Those are the helpers. Right. So we're in a productive state. Websites are being built. Websites are being deployed. Customers are kind of happy, and they will happily pay. But then they will also have to pay pretty much for a rewrite every time. Every time you have to add something, you go in and you find, oh yeah, what did the previous person do? I don't know, log into the FTP server, download the website, if you can find the FTP server, and let's hope that there is something that we can understand. So it wasn't really that cool, and there was very little discipline. There is still very little discipline, by the way. We're getting better, though. A few years later came, I would say, the first libraries, the first frameworks. We're talking about, I would say, 2006, 2007, kind of like the first wave of frameworks starting to become more popular. And obviously, framework authors know what they're doing, right? We all know exactly what we're doing. There's never a security issue in a framework, right? Everything is safe. I think what is most important about this phase of our history is that we're starting to separate things. We're saying this goes here and that goes there, and we're not smashing everything together. And this, I think, is a big, big win. So we introduced this thing called MVC. Right? We stole a concept coming from ages ago, used to design UIs, and we said, you know, like, it looks like a good way to separate things, to say, we're going to put this here, and we're going to put that other thing there. It's not MVC, of course. We're talking about an MVC-ish system. And the reason is that MVC doesn't really work over HTTP. But this discussion came much later. We're talking 2010, right? 2010, people start saying, you know what, MVC is probably not such a good thing for HTTP. It's not a good fit. But still, we are separating things. So we start introducing this concept of a controller, okay? Assuming people write decent code, which they don't, by the way, you start having some decent separation of things. Here, you have a purchase controller. The purchase controller extends the base controller. You always extend the base controller, always. That was how we did it. And then we have this purchase action. So Always extend from a framework, because the framework knows what is best for you, right? It's always there. Nowadays as well, right? No, don't do that. Now we have a name for what we're doing, which is also a big win. We also did these migrations where we took files and put them into controllers, one by one, separated actions. And then we have some security. So we're checking if it is a coyote, then we're allowing access, otherwise we're just using this not allowed. And these is coyote and this not allowed are usually shared across all our controllers. They're like there. They're free to be used everywhere. Useful. And we have some validation. I would say done kind of properly. Don't agree with it all the time, but it's not like we're accepting everything that comes in. It's not all garbage that comes in is being accepted, which is a big win there. And we have database abstractions. Database abstractions that start with, I don't know, AdoDB, I think. There was a lot of stuff on pair that I don't even find anymore. But we have some kind of abstraction that allows us to say, this is how we fetch a record, and we don't have an attack vector in that area. This is progress. This is good progress, I think. So after just 4 or 5 years of writing random stuff, we start writing some relatively structured stuff, and we got rid of a lot of security issues. So we got a lot of XSS fixed, assuming people write and use escaping, right? We have forms, which means that garbage doesn't come in all the time, assuming people use forms. We have CSRF. Who learned CSRF from a framework? Come on, so little. Everyone knows about the OWASP and went directly to OWASP.com or whatever it is. Oh, well, the frameworks introduce some stuff that we kind of like learn to acquire, make ourselves comfortable with, like, for example, CSRF validation and session security, and making sure that the session is regenerated when you do a login and all that stuff. We have a data abstraction layer, so we get rid of most SQL injections, assuming you use the interface correctly. The term interface is still very blurry. It's more like, here you got a bunch of classes, do whatever you want. It's not really interfaces, it's more like, here, you got a dumpster fire, take what you want. And we got mailer abstractions, which also helps a lot. So, we are still relying a lot on helpers. Right? I'm talking about these guys here. Talking about these methods calls here. These are shared across all our controllers. We're relying heavily on them. And this is kind of still problematic. And what we usually have is something like this somewhere. We have our base controller. Now, I oversimplified it. We have this magic call thing. PHP magic has been a huge enabler and a huge problem lately as well. I'm also part of the problem there. But we have this helper registry factory thing. We copied a lot of stuff from Java when making frameworks. We get some helper and we call it. And the problem with these helpers is that they're pretty much registries. They're static registries. You have a bunch of stuff in there. You can grab from it, and it's very unstructured. You don't have a clean way to build them. And also, they kind of stay in memory once you use them. So if anybody has used like a redirect tool, and you call the redirect twice, the application starts doing very funky stuff, just because these helpers are not really designed to be used more than once. That is, again, a problem. Anyone recognize this? Don't tell me where it comes from. Don't say anything. But if you recognize this, raise your hand. Really? OK. Well, one tip. It doesn't come from 27. It doesn't come from 2007. OK? So, and the other problem here is that, well, douchebag users, they put everything, they slam everything in a controller. Everything is in there. Now, all the logic, everything is in there, except for the view, which is good. We abstracted that away. We now have everything in one place again for that particular interaction. There is still no concept of services, of separating out the models. We had this name model. Model meant, database model meant database record. It didn't really mean some bigger concept. Nowadays, if you talk me about models, I'm like, what does model even mean? It's just too broad of a concept, and at the time, for us, the model was the database record. And we have more problems. We have a lot of framework coupling. So while we got rid of a lot of problems that are just there because the average user does not think about CSRF, XSS, SQL injections, they don't have this all the time in mind. The average developer is just a human being, and they do mistakes. If you know a developer that is not a human being, I want to talk to you. We have this initiative is called Man in Black. And we have this framework, which is just a singleton somewhere. The framework is one and unique, and you can never have another framework. That is still true for a lot of frameworks, by the way. So it's like this God object in every sense of the word. And you have other things that are really funky. So you have this zero argument thing. You have these helpers, and these helpers, you can only call them, use them, instantiate them, if they have no arguments. So inside them, you still have a lot of logic that fetches things from globals, from places where they shouldn't even be able to read. But these are things that we understand much later in the progress of the evolution of frameworks. And we're using this auto-loading as a service location mechanism. We're talking about PHP 5 already, so we have this concept of auto-loading. We did it with __ auto-load. But some of these frameworks also use like require ones all over the place. Requires everywhere, which makes our applications super, super slow. And testing. These problems introduce a lot of trouble when trying to test. The first wave of people saying we need to start testing stuff, I think it came 2009 or something like that, 2009, 2010. Before it was mostly an unknown thing, this testing, this concept of testing. No, if it works, ship it. If you like loaded the page once, you ship it. There was not this concept of trying out everything your code does. But if you wanted to try it out, then you quickly hit a wall, because this code was very magic. We're doing a lot of things under the hood that were very unpredictable. And then we evolved again. Then there was another wave. So first wave, early 2000s. Then we have 2006, 2007, another first introduction of frameworks. Then we have another evolution. This is 2011. We started rewriting some frameworks. So some of them changed completely, some of them remained the same, but we noticed there is a problem. There are many problems, and we need to improve. So, yeah, we start having some different way of writing code. Is anybody from Magento? Sorry, I mean Adobe here. Sorry, I'm just kidding. Yeah. I have good friends at Magento, so Magento, I don't know. They say Magento in Germany, but I lived there for too long. So you start having these constructors with 100 things in them, which looks a bit scary, but that's the kind of right way to declare I'm using these things. And these are okay-ish, I think. We are still extending from this base controller. The framework is still there. We're still suggesting that. And I think a lot of the mistakes we did in this other wave is that we preferred usability over improving the ecosystem. So we improved a lot of things, but we did it in a gradual step, which means that there's a lot to change also later, especially on these coupling problems. So now we have implicit things very explicit. We're declaring variables. I still see a lot of code where variables are not declared, which properties are not declared in classes, especially in tests. I see that a lot. Nowadays, it's obviously recognized by tooling, so you get a warning and all that stuff. But PHP is a very, very, I would say, yeah, it's a very easy language. It is easy also on you. It doesn't bother about telling you if something is undefined, if you set a property on the fly. So we are setting stuff. We're doing this thing called dependency injection. It took like 3 years to explain it to people. What is dependency injection? What is a dependency injection container? What is inversion of control? Nobody knows. It's still nobody knows how to describe them in a clear way. And don't ask me to do that, please. And then we have the same code. It's the same code as before. But we are doing some, I would say, easier to follow steps, and we don't grab these things magically. So every one of these calls can be inspected. We can jump around. We used to have NetBeans. Anybody still use NetBeans? All right. No. Aptana Studio. Notepad++. Also not Notepad++ could still jump around, which is quite impressive for a text editor. Yeah. Now you can test this. This was the biggest win, I think, because this enabled people to test stuff and expect behavior without too much magic in it. There's still a lot of magic, but not too much of it. Progress, therefore. We are improving. Right. There's still a lot of framework coupling. A lot of framework coupling means pretty much rewriting every time you upgrade. This means that what happens over the years now is that these changes enabled a set of practices to rise, and these practices led to people being unhappy about the framework doing X or Y. So we had the rise of dependency injection. We've seen that. Yeah, okay, that's a big DI. We had this TDD, EDD, ORM, there's a lot of these, right? But we have new practices. We're introducing new practices. They become widespread. Everyone starts understanding them. If you can't describe it, you probably don't fully understand it, but it's okay if you already start using them. And somebody can tell you if you're doing it right or wrong. That's already helping a lot. But we are going in a different direction. We are introducing these ORM things. I think every framework at some point started doing that. And the reason was because we thought that SQL was a big problem, so we abstracted away from it everywhere. And a lot of people got really fixated with it. Everything needs to go through the ORM. I've seen that in many companies, and I've seen other companies doing everything needs to go through SQL. Please find a balance, right? Don't do everything there. And then I think the biggest one lately is this domain-driven development movement. And this domain-driven development movement is, I think, started around 2014 or something for the PHP community. It started much earlier for C#, the .NET world, and the Java world. But we are very good thieves. We're like pirates. We go around in companies and we find code that we can copy and we drag it into our language and make it our own. And these practices changed how we think about software, what we are supposed to do. And I think that's for good. But this means that now we have a radically different way of thinking about software. And we still have a lot of this framework coupling, which is also another problem that keeps itching us. And every time we upgrade our framework, we have everything broken, and we need like 3 weeks to make a patch release upgrade to something. So security issues are kind of solved, but still a problem. So we need another evolution. And I think, at least in my opinion, so we're starting to get into the opinionated world. This is now what I think. It's not about what the ecosystem necessarily thinks. I think the evolution that we're going forward to is this middleware thing. So we are doing HTTP stuff. And HTTP is a series of packages going through a set of layers. So you have your local machine, your browser, your HTTP client, then you have a proxy somewhere, you have on the other side a caching system, a reverse proxy, you have some authorization system, and so on. So I took this from the HTTP Middleworld website, and I think this is very clear on what middleware means, pretty much. So you have a system where the request goes in, you drop some luggage on the way in, then you do your passport check, you do the boarding, right? If you manage to grab the plane, and then you do the same on the other way out. It's layers, right? It's protection layers. Every time you go in, you either add or remove a bit, but you're doing some work that is not necessarily related to the flight. Honestly, most people don't even care about passport check. This is something governments care about, not really we. Right, so let's look at our purchase action. So it looks very similar to what we had before, but we got rid of the extends clause. There is no extends anymore. very good improvement. So, yeah. Now we have this invoke thing. It's also a new thing that is kind of raising. We have one class with one thing happening in there. There's no more a controller with 20,000 things and slam everything into the controller. You know, this is the application controller, and you have like 3,000 lines of code if it's short. I've seen controllers with more than 40,000 lines. You have a request that goes in, and you have a response that goes out. Interestingly, this is what the Java world has been doing for 20 years, which is pretty okay, I guess. But it's, yeah, it took a bit of time for us to figure it out, right? But again, we are doing the actual actions, the work. So what is interesting here is that we now don't care about the form. We just get some validated data. We get some user, right? It comes from somewhere. We don't care that much. And then we do some, yes, there's still some magic, this purchase with user. We get them from this products thing, and then we send some notification, whatever. But we are doing just what is important to our application. And instead, we have another layer, which is about checking that only Coyotes can buy our stuff. And this only Coyotes is responsible for kicking the user out if the user is not a Coyote. So how do we know who that user is? So we have another middleware, which is taking only the authenticated users, and it's going to, you know, do some stuff with cookies down there. And it will intercept the request, and it will kick you out if you're not authenticated. I think this is separating things on a different level. We don't have this, just this MVC. We're separating every bit of the application, so we don't keep repeating all this authentication, this security stuff all the time, but we kind of isolate it in pieces that we can verify separately. And then we have only with valid form data, which is the same thing. It does some form validation. And if it doesn't validate, then it will, you know, like render a response and say, here you got a 422 status code, which means entity unprocessable. And what your application looks like, or at least this part of the application, is that you can now have a pipe. I don't know if this is correct. I mean, in the middleware world, we call it pipe because you have a request comes in, and then on the other side, a response comes out. You know, it's percolating through. And you have this pipeline where you define single atomic bits of work. Every one of these pieces can be removed and replaced with something that is more, I would say, flexible. And I really like this syntax for it. I think at some point we really need something like this. Yes, of course, I'm a Haskell nut, so you will see some Haskell slides. But this is the point. You're piping through, right? Only authenticated, then only Coyotes, then only with valid form, and only with, and then perform a purchase. This is how I like to think about this. You have a top-down read of what is going on. So what we got from this are the PSR standards. They allowed us to move away from a lot of this framework stuff. They allowed us to decouple. We have now, well, standard for autoloading. We're a bit further away from autoloading, but we started from there. We now have a single way to load libraries, and if we didn't have that, it would be quite a mess. We have Composer that allows us to rely on this autoloading, so we can now finally require packages without copy-pasting from PHP classes. Don't do that. And we have an abstraction for HTTP packages. Yes, it's overhead, but before, everyone had their own. Everyone had their own abstraction because you had these super globals, and you needed to check every damn key in the super globals. We have this PSR 11, which, again, not necessarily the best pattern because it's about service location. And service location is not necessarily good, but it is needed in order to make some parts of these libraries and frameworks work. And then we have this PSR 15, which is pretty much the middleware that I've already shown you. The point is, there's no framework here. There's no framework here. There's no framework. This is just these standards, these interoperable standards, so you can just plug and change library, and it should work the same way. It will not work all the same way all the time, but if you have a decent integration test, you can really migrate from one framework to the other if you say, we prefer that community or this community, which is good. We're allowing people to move back and forth between communities. And I think this cross-pollinating is important in order to change ideas inside an ecosystem. The idea is to kill the framework. The framework should no longer be the central part of the application. It should no longer be the thing that we talk about when we're discussing about a problem in our company. The word framework should not come out of this. It should be we should focus on what the real problems are and just leave the heavy-duty stuff or doing HTTP problem-related calculations or whatever to these libraries. No longer really frameworks. The framework gets back to being the framework. It's a frame. Once you build a structure, you don't see the frames anymore. You finish building something, you don't see what is inside there. Okay? That's the point. It's just there to support you while building. It's not supposed to be visible everywhere. Okay? Otherwise, you call it modern art, and it's an outlier. And we are trying to reduce the risk of rewriting every time. Yes, rewriting every time brings you money. Okay? Yes, and you get a lot of consultancy gigs, yeah? Right? Can you help me migrate this application to do this and this and that? Yes, it's going to cost you a gazillion euro. Right? Don't worry, we'll do it, but it will cost you, a lung or something. We're pushing some new things. We're pushing immutability. We're pushing new patterns that are now framework unrelated, I think. This is also good. We're pushing things into how you write code and not what code you inherit. So we're pushing mutability. We have this concept called value object. Values as value objects. So you have this thing, you have a shape, you push it through your system, it can't go wrong. It's no longer an array with random keys. It's no longer a super global that you push through the system. You have very well-defined structures that tell you how the data should look like. And this brings stability in your system, and it brings understanding in your system. So you can look at your system after 3 years and hope to understand at least 10% of it. Not more than 10%, by the way. Yeah, that's normal. So you have something like this. This is a user ID. I make this a sample a lot because it's a stupid class. It doesn't do much. It's just an object, which brings a lot of memory overhead, but still. You have this thing, you construct it with a number, and then you have some assertion that verifies just that it must be greater than 0, because that's what for you is a user ID, and that's enough. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. You can push this thing around in your system. You can rely on it, and it helps you a lot on understanding what the system expects from you, what kind of input. So here you have something that I used yesterday in a workshop, for example. You have this check password. You have a clear text password in and a password hash in. There is no way you can swap them. It's not string. There is no way that from a clear text password you get the password, because the thing is not designed to render the password. You can only ask it, for example, to hash or check a hash, which means that you will not have a security leak there, because it's really, really hard to get the data out of it. And you get static analysis tools. There's a lot of evolution about this. I think this year and last year, a lot of tools were kind of born and evolved. We're talking about PHP Static Analyzer, Psalm from Vimeo, Exacut. These are very useful tools that you can install, run them before your tests. You can just run them before your test. They find so many problems. And when you're green, when you don't have any of these problems anymore, you can move and focus on the testing part. And as long as these tools guarantee that you're not passing shit around, if you pass shit in, shit comes out, this no longer happens. If you pass shit in, the system crashes, which is better than shit in, shit out. It's a bit better. Maybe we will get generics. See what I did there? Again, sorry, FP joke. We're going to functional programming. We are moving to different ways of elaborating data. We're seeing that mutations of state and shared state are problems in our software. That's where tools for like what Derek writes are useful. you start a debugger and you try to understand why things are the way they are. And instead, what if we try to reduce these state mutations to the minimum? It will not get rid of a debugger. I like Xdebug, by the way, don't worry. It's a great tool, but you should use it less. You should have more like a definition of how your program works, and then have as little state mutating as possible. Another thing that I really like, and I think very few people realize, is that a class with just a constructor and invoke, what is this class? It's a function. What is this? Anybody got a better definition? Oh, C++. C++ is hell. A class, it is a curried function. A curried function. A curried function is a function where you remove parameters one by one. So you're pretty much saying, okay, I have this function, I'm removing parameters, and you get a new function which has these parameters removed. So we have a register user. Register user requires a database, a create user, some user data, and does some work. The curried version of it is just get some user data and do some work. How do you get that curried register user? That's a detail. But that's the point. You are removing parameters. So you have this register user class with a constructor, database, and create user, some user data. That's the same thing as before. And here we have the same version in PHP with a function. Okay, this is the same exact thing as the class I wrote you before. You have a database, a create user, and user data. And here's the curried version. You do a curry of it. You take register user, you curry it, and this is exactly like a constructor call. Exactly like that. So we're moving back into a world of, I would just say, functions. It's just that functions are really hard to use in PHP because they don't have autoloading and all that stuff. So we are pushing functional patterns also to the storage. I wouldn't brag too much about it, but I talked about it last year. We have this event sourcing thing. Event sourcing is about not updating the storage, not changing the storage, but just adding things to it. So you have as little mutation as possible, and instead you have outcomes where you run something, you have a history before, you run something in between, and you get more history out. Right. So this is probably the death of object relational mappers. It's not necessarily the death of object relational mappers. There's still a lot of use cases. But if you're doing complex business stuff, you probably don't want to update data that much. You want to focus on logging and working on those logs. So, yeah. And if you put it all together, it becomes something like that. If you pipe everything through the system, then you get pretty much a simple pipe of everything that your system does. So you have an application, you get a request in and response out. So first of all, you load the request. I don't know where that happens. That's still something that is a bit global. In PHP, we have this concept of a Sappy, a server API apparently, which is the part responsible for populating $post and $request and so on. So we route the purchase, then we run it through the authentication, then we run it only through Coyotes. Only Coyotes can purchase our stuff. Then we only validate through form data. Then we we create some command. We say, okay, just make sure the form, the input data is valid. Then you load some history from the database, right? I'm doing this currying thing here, kind of. And then you purchase, and then you take the new history that the application produced and save it into the database, and then you take that new history and produce a response. Not necessarily, this is just pseudocode. This is not necessarily how we will write applications, but it is a very simple pipe. And if we make it work like this, we can add a lot of tooling to intercept, to log at different levels, to have a different way of debugging, to look at applications that is hopefully simpler. And if you write an application like this, you plug it into React PHP front end, right? And you have a long-running application. You can use Swool or other kind of like application servers. What is important here is that service location is gone. There is no space for service location anymore. We know it's a problem. We try to reduce it to the minimum. We are removing the helpers. The helpers are gone. We're no longer doing things in the middle of our logic where we just, ask somebody else, just tell me about it. we are now removing them. We're just piping through. Every layer is responsible for taking a couple decisions, not more. So we are making function composition. This piping thing is pretty much function composition. We are making them different functions. We're saying first this, then this, then this, and this, and this. It's not different than, you know, like first line, do this, semicolon, next line, do this, semicolon. It's the same thing. It's just that we have atomic units that do decisions and we can just chain them together. Yeah, so most of the if-else logic is gone. It's part of one other decision somewhere. We're getting rid of shared mutable state. And I think we're getting away with a new way of designing object-oriented programming, because I think, at least this is something Anthony said, that good object-oriented programming is pretty much functional programming. I don't think he said exactly this, all right? But it's pretty much in that direction. So Anthony, I'm making you famous. Sorry. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth. What's up next? That's mostly up to you. You have to figure out how we want to go, in which direction. There's a lot of activity in this area, so we'll have to see what is going on there. I think we're going in the right direction, but I hope everyone joins in and tries to think about how we can improve the ecosystem at large. If you have any questions, feel free to tweet at me. Feel free to tweet at me or at Rove Team, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for a great talk. All this talk is not about the technology, it's about way of thinking, because it's evolution of thinking and understanding. Do you think that this change of how do we think about this ecosystem will fastly change how do we write it? Because the system consists of multiple layers and multiple small things. For now, for most of developers, it's just harder to understand. It's easy to put everything in one place and so on. How do you expect this change will happen?
If you look at, for example, at the JavaScript ecosystem, let's take functional reactive programming and all the ecosystem around React.js. They built tooling that gives you a way to go back and forward in history and look at what the application was rendering or what it was doing in the past. This is just one example, but I think the tooling is the enabler here, because you give developers better tools to understand what is going on. And instead, if we keep writing imperative programs like we usually do, currently the best tools we have are written by Mr. Derek Redhands here in the front line. So that's the best we got so far. It's a good tool, yes, but I think we need to explore and go forward and find new ways to look at our applications, understand them, convert an application not just to text on an editor, but convert it to a diagram that we can look at, have a history of what our application did. These are all things that are very useful, because our time does not go into writing new software. Writing new software is something we do quickly. The problem is looking at software that is running, looking at what is wrong with it, and trying to understand how to fix it. That's where we waste time nowadays. So the more tooling we have that gives us an idea of what the software is doing, the more we are moving in a direction that makes it easy for that tooling to thrive and improve.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one more short question. Anybody?
Just half a question.
Half a question. Okay, there is there, over there. You were the first, sorry.
Why do you not use PSL middleware in your examples?
Sorry, why don't you use what?
PSL middleware.
I just try to use different things. It's not that I don't use tools. I try to move into a direction that I think is improving things. If you look at my discussions in general on the internet, because I'm one of those people that stays up at night because somebody is wrong on the internet. That's me, sorry. It's probably the worst kind of internet user, by the way. So annoying, right? I try to push forward. I try to improve, and I think we explored a lot of stuff and we found problems in a lot of stuff. We need to find new approaches that have less problems, reduce those problems, or improve the usability a lot from a developer perspective. So it's not like I don't use tools, I try to generally improve or find new ways to use new tools. And once I found a new tool that did better than the previous one, I say, let's not use the previous one. Let's start removing it, because there is a better way. Okay?